You've tried everything. You've set the alarms. You've made the plans. You've written the goals on sticky notes and put them on your bathroom mirror. You've downloaded the productivity apps, bought the leather journals, watched the motivational speeches at 6 a.m., and told yourself with complete sincerity that this time would be different. And for a few days, maybe even a few weeks, it was. You felt it, that momentum, that clarity, that feeling of finally being the person you always knew you could be. But then it stopped. Slowly at first, then all at once. And you told yourself the same story you always tell yourself when this happens. I just don't have enough discipline. I'm not built for consistency. Other people can do this. I just can't seem to make it stick. But here's the truth that nobody in the self-help world wants to say out loud. Discipline was never your problem. It was never about willpower. It was never about motivation. It was never about finding the right system or the right morning routine or the right productivity hack or the right accountability partner. Your real problem goes much deeper than any of those things. And until you address it at the root, nothing, not a single strategy, not a single technique, not a single book or course or coach, will ever create lasting change in your life. Your real problem is your identity. Who you believe yourself to be. The story you carry about what kind of person you are. And today, we are going to dismantle that story completely and rebuild it from the ground up. Introduction. Think about this for a moment. You don't have to force yourself to brush your teeth every morning. You don't struggle with discipline when it comes to checking your phone. You don't need a motivational speech to make you eat food when you're hungry or breathe when your body needs oxygen. Why? Because those behaviors are perfectly aligned with who you believe you are. They require no willpower because they don't conflict with your self-concept. They feel automatic, natural, effortless, not because they are easy, but because they are consistent with your identity. Now think about the habits you keep failing at. The gym, the diet, the meditation practice, the early mornings, the business you said you'd start, the book you said you'd write, the skill you said you'd learn, the version of yourself you keep promising yourself you'll become. Why do those feel like a constant battle? Why does every attempt feel like you're swimming against a powerful current that always, eventually, pulls you back? Because deep down, at the level of identity, at the level of your most fundamental beliefs about who you are, you don't actually believe you are that person yet. You want the results of a disciplined person. You admire disciplined people. You can describe in perfect detail what your life would look like if you were more disciplined. But you still see yourself as someone who struggles with discipline. And your brain will always, always, always act in alignment with the identity it believes to be true. This is not a motivational problem. This is not a scheduling problem. This is not a character flaw or a genetic limitation or evidence that you are somehow less capable than other people. This is an identity problem. And identity problems require identity solutions. By the time you finish listening to this, you will understand not just why you keep failing at discipline, but exactly how to rewire your self-concept from the inside out. You will have a complete framework for becoming the person you need to be in order to build the life you actually want. Not through force, not through punishment, not through sheer grinding willpower that burns out every single time. Through identity, through evidence, through the deliberate, systematic construction of a new self-concept that makes your desired behaviors feel not like effort, but like integrity. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Discipline Myth: Why Everything You've Been Told Is Wrong. For decades, the self-improvement industry has sold you a lie. The lie is this: if you want to change your life, you need more discipline. More willpower, more grit, more hustle, more pushing through the resistance until your habits become automatic. And millions of people have bought this lie completely. They wake up and punish themselves for snoozing the alarm. They shame themselves every time they miss a workout. They berate themselves for lack of willpower as if the solution to failing at discipline is simply to be harder on themselves until discipline mysteriously appears. And it never works. Not in the long run. Not sustainably. And the reason it never works is because the entire premise is wrong. Willpower is not a character trait. It is a resource. And like every resource, it depletes. Research from Roy Baumeister at Florida State University, one of the world's leading experts on willpower, demonstrated through decades of experiments that willpower operates like a muscle that fatigues with use. Every decision you make, every temptation you resist, every moment you force yourself to do something that conflicts with how you see yourself drains from the same limited pool of mental energy. This is called ego depletion. And it explains why you can be perfectly disciplined in the morning and completely fall apart by evening. It explains why people who are highly controlled at work often lose all self-regulation at home. It explains why strict diets almost always lead to binging. The resource runs out, and when it does, your behavior defaults back to what feels natural and automatic. Back to your identity. Because here is the fundamental truth that changes everything. Willpower is a bridge. Identity is the destination. Willpower can get you started. It can carry you across the gap between who you are and who you want to be in the short term. But it cannot sustain you. It was never designed to. The people who appear to have extraordinary discipline are not burning through extraordinary amounts of willpower. They have done something far more powerful. They have aligned their identity with their desired behaviors. So those behaviors no longer require willpower at all. Let me prove this to you with a simple thought experiment. Imagine you are trying to build a daily reading habit. Every evening you sit down to read, but after 10 minutes your mind wanders, you check your phone, and eventually you give up. You tell yourself you need more discipline. Now imagine someone who has been a voracious reader their entire adult life. They read every single night without fail. Without alarm reminders, without accountability apps, without willpower battles. Do they have more discipline than you? No. They have a different identity. They are a reader. Reading is not something they force themselves to do. It is something they do because it is who they are. Missing a night of reading would feel wrong to them. It would feel inconsistent. It would create a kind of psychological discomfort that motivates them to pick the book back up. That psychological discomfort is the secret weapon that identity gives you. When your behavior conflicts with your values and goals, willpower steps in to bridge the gap. But when your behavior conflicts with your identity, something far more powerful activates. The deep human need for consistency. The neurological drive to act in alignment with your self-concept. Psychologist Leon Festinger called this cognitive dissonance. The mental discomfort that arises when your actions contradict your beliefs about yourself. And here is the key insight that most people completely miss. You can weaponize cognitive dissonance. Right now, cognitive dissonance is working against you. Every time you skip the gym, your brain notices the gap between who you say you want to be and what you actually did. But instead of motivating you to change, it resolves the dissonance by updating your identity downward. Your brain says, well, I guess you're just not the kind of person who goes to the gym consistently. But once you have established a new identity, cognitive dissonance flips. Now when you skip the gym, your brain says, wait. This doesn't match who I am. I am someone who shows up for their health. This doesn't feel right. I need to correct this. The discomfort now drives you toward consistency rather than away from it. This is the fundamental shift that separates people who struggle with discipline their entire lives from people who seem to maintain their habits effortlessly. It is not effort, it is identity. Now let's go even deeper. There is a reason that most habit advice focuses on the wrong level of change entirely. James Clear, in his research on behavior change, identifies 3 distinct layers of how humans change. The outermost layer is outcomes. This is the level most people focus on. Lose 20 pounds. Make $1 million. Write a book. Run a marathon. These are the results you want. The middle layer is processes. This is where most habit systems live. The routines, the schedules, the systems, the frameworks. How you do what you do. But the deepest layer, the one that determines whether any of it actually sticks, is identity. Who you believe yourself to be. Most people try to change from the outside in. They start with the outcome they want, design a process to get there, and hope that eventually it changes who they are. This almost never works. The approach that actually creates permanent change works from the inside out. You start by deciding who you want to be. You build evidence for that identity through small daily actions. And the outcomes follow naturally because they are the inevitable result of who you have become. This is not a subtle difference. It is a complete reversal of how most people approach self-improvement. And it explains everything. It explains why the same person can try the same diet 10 times and fail 10 times. Because they are always starting from the outside. They want the outcome of being healthy without ever doing the identity work of becoming someone who is healthy. It explains why some people can quit smoking cold turkey while others struggle for decades. The ones who quit successfully have made an identity shift. The ones who keep struggling are fighting against an identity that still sees itself as a smoker. It explains why some entrepreneurs succeed with mediocre ideas while others fail with brilliant ones. Because the successful ones believe at the identity level that they are someone who figures things out, who persists, who belongs in the space of entrepreneurship. The ones who fail often spend every day secretly waiting to be exposed as someone who was never really cut out for this. The discipline myth is costing you years of your life. Every year you spend trying to force behaviors that don't match your identity is a year you could have spent building an identity that makes those behaviors inevitable. The question is not how do I get more disciplined. The question is who do I need to become so that this behavior feels natural. That question will change your life. Chapter 2. How your identity was built without your knowledge or consent. Before we talk about how to change your identity, you need to understand something that might be deeply uncomfortable. The identity you are living right now was almost entirely not chosen by you. It was assigned to you. Piece by piece, year by year, message by message, experience by experience, long before you had the cognitive capacity to evaluate whether any of it was actually true. Your identity is largely a collection of conclusions your brain drew about yourself based on experiences you had as a child and adolescent. Experiences filtered through environments you did not choose, interpreted through cognitive frameworks you had not yet developed, absorbed during years when the architecture of your brain was still being constructed. Let's walk through exactly how this happens. From birth to approximately age 7, your brain operates in a state that neuroscientists have compared to a hypnotic trance. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for critical thinking, analysis, and evaluation, is largely undeveloped. You are not yet capable of questioning what you are told. You are simply absorbing. Everything you see, hear, feel, and experience during these years goes directly into your subconscious mind without a filter. Without scrutiny. Without the ability to say, wait, is that actually true? Does that actually apply to me? Every message your parents sent you about your worth, your capabilities, your limitations, your place in the world went straight in. Not just the messages they said with words. The messages they sent with their behavior, their reactions, their expressions, their silences. The way they treated you when you succeeded. The way they treated you when you failed. If you grew up being praised only for achievement, you may have absorbed the identity of someone whose worth is conditional on performance. And now, decades later, you avoid situations where you might fail not because you are lazy but because failure feels like a threat to your fundamental value as a person. If you grew up in an environment where money was always scarce and stress-inducing, you likely absorbed beliefs about money as dangerous, elusive, or reserved for other kinds of people. And now, no matter how hard you consciously try to build financial success, some part of you keeps pulling you back to the familiar level of scarcity because that is what feels like home. If you were told repeatedly that you were smart but struggled in a particular subject, you may have resolved that dissonance by concluding that you are simply not someone who is good at that thing. And that conclusion became a wall you stopped trying to climb years ago. These conclusions are called core beliefs, and they form the bedrock of your identity. Here is where it gets even more complex. Between the ages of 7 and 14, your brain begins developing more sophisticated social cognition. You become acutely aware of how you appear to others. You begin comparing yourself to your peers. And your identity starts being shaped not just by your family, but by your social environment. The things your peers said about you. The social hierarchies you experienced. The moments of inclusion and exclusion. The times you spoke up and were laughed at. The times you tried something new and were judged. The times you were told you were too much or not enough or different in ways that felt like a verdict rather than an observation. All of this became data. And your brain processed that data the only way it knew how. By constructing a self-concept that would help you navigate your environment as safely as possible. By developing an identity that protected you from the most painful experiences and helped you secure the most important rewards. If being small, quiet, and invisible kept you safe, your brain built an identity around smallness. If being funny deflected criticism and earned affection, your brain built an identity around humor as a survival strategy. If being the smart one or the responsible one or the helpful one earned you love and safety, your brain built that role into the foundation of who you believe yourself to be. None of this makes you broken. All of it makes you human. And here is the critical point. The identity that protected a 7-year-old in a particular environment may be actively destroying a 35-year-old in a completely different world. The child who learned to stay small to avoid criticism becomes the adult who never speaks up in meetings and watches less qualified people get promoted ahead of them. The child who learned that expressing needs led to rejection becomes the adult who is chronically unable to ask for what they want in relationships and careers. The child who was told they were not academic becomes the adult who never pursues the education or career they actually want because they still believe, at the deepest level, that they are not that kind of person. And here is the cruelest irony of all. Your brain does not just passively hold these beliefs. It actively defends them. This is a phenomenon called identity protective cognition. Your brain will filter, distort, and selectively interpret your experiences to maintain consistency with your existing self-concept. When you succeed at something that contradicts your identity, your brain will attribute it to luck, timing, or external factors. When you fail at something that confirms your identity, your brain will treat it as definitive evidence of your inherent limitations. You will literally fail to notice your own accomplishments because they do not fit the story you are telling about yourself. You will unconsciously recreate familiar dynamics in new environments because familiar feels safe even when it is painful. You will sabotage opportunities that would require you to step into a bigger version of yourself because your nervous system has been trained to experience that expansion as a threat. This is not weakness. This is the result of a brilliant adaptive system that was built for survival and was never designed to help you thrive. Understanding this is not about assigning blame. Not to your parents. Not to your teachers. Not to your past. Most of the people who shaped your identity did so unconsciously, passing on the same limitations they absorbed from their own upbringing without any conscious awareness or malicious intent. Understanding this is about awareness. Because you cannot change what you cannot see. And the moment you can see your identity clearly, see it as something that was constructed rather than discovered, as a collection of learned beliefs rather than objective truth, everything becomes possible. Because what was built can be rebuilt. And what was learned can be unlearned. Chapter 3. The Neuroscience of Identity Change. What's actually happening in your brain? Most people think of their identity as something abstract, a psychological concept, a story they tell about themselves. But your identity is not just a story. It is a physical structure. And understanding the neuroscience of how identity is encoded in your brain is one of the most empowering things you will ever learn. Because it proves, at the biological level, that change is not just possible. It is inevitable when you apply the right inputs consistently. Let's start with the fundamental unit of identity in your brain, the neural pathway. Every belief you hold about yourself, every habitual thought pattern, every automatic emotional response, every ingrained behavior is encoded in your brain as a network of neurons that fire together. The more you have thought a thought, felt a feeling, or repeated a behavior, the stronger and more efficient that neural network becomes. Neuroscientists describe this process with the phrase, neurons that fire together wire together. This is Hebb's law, and it explains everything about why your current identity feels so real, so solid, so absolutely true. When you have thought, "I'm not disciplined," thousands of times across years and decades, that thought becomes a superhighway in your brain. It fires instantly, automatically, and with enormous force. It does not feel like a thought you are choosing to think. It feels like a fact you are simply recognizing. But it is a pathway, not a truth. And here is the extraordinary thing about your brain that most people never fully appreciate. Your brain is plastic. Not in the future, not with the right medication or technology or circumstances. Right now, today, at this exact moment. Neuroplasticity is the scientifically established capacity of the human brain to form new neural connections, strengthen existing pathways, and weaken others throughout your entire life. Not just in childhood, not just during sensitive developmental periods, but at every age, in response to every experience, thought, and behavior. Every time you think a new thought, you begin building a new neural pathway. Every time you repeat that thought, you strengthen it. Every time you act in alignment with a new identity, you reinforce the neural architecture that supports it. And every time you choose not to engage the old thought, not to indulge the old story, not to follow the old behavioral pattern, you weaken the old pathway through a process called synaptic pruning. Connections that are not used are gradually dismantled. The superhighway of the old identity begins to narrow. This process takes time. It requires repetition. It is not linear, but it is absolutely, definitively real. Research from Dr. Michael Merzenich, one of the world's leading experts on neuroplasticity, shows that the brain can reorganize itself significantly within weeks of consistent new inputs. Studies on habit formation by Philippa Lally and her colleagues at University College London found that new habits take an average of 66 days to become automatic, though this varies significantly based on complexity, emotional salience, and consistency. What this tells us is that identity change is not an event. It is a process, a biological process that follows predictable rules and responds to consistent inputs. You are not stuck with the brain you have been using. You are one decision away from beginning to build the brain you need. But let's go even deeper. Because there is another neurological system that plays a crucial role in identity formation and change. The limbic system, and specifically, the amygdala. Your amygdala is your brain's threat detection center. Its job, developed over millions of years of evolution, is to scan your environment for danger and trigger defensive responses. And here is the critical thing that most people do not understand. Your amygdala does not distinguish between physical threats and psychological threats. To your amygdala, the prospect of changing your identity feels exactly like physical danger. When you try to step into a new version of yourself, when you attempt to behave in ways that contradict your existing self-concept, your amygdala sounds the alarm. It floods your system with stress hormones. It generates anxiety, resistance, discomfort, and the overwhelming urge to retreat to the familiar. This is not weakness. This is your ancient survival system doing its job. The familiar feels safe to your amygdala even when it is harmful. The unfamiliar feels dangerous even when it is beneficial. This is why change is uncomfortable. Not because there is something wrong with you, but because your brain is literally treating your personal growth as a threat to your survival. Understanding this gives you two enormous advantages. First, it normalizes the discomfort of change. When you feel resistance, anxiety, or the urge to quit when you are trying to build a new identity, you can recognize it for what it actually is. Not a sign that you should stop. Not confirmation that you are incapable. Just your amygdala doing what amygdalas do. Second, it shows you how to work with your brain instead of against it. Your amygdala responds to repetition and familiarity. The more you repeat a new behavior, the more familiar it becomes. And as it becomes familiar, it begins to feel safe. The resistance decreases. The discomfort fades. What once felt threatening begins to feel natural. This is the neurological explanation for why consistency is more important than intensity when building a new identity. A massive effort once a week does less to rewire your brain than a small consistent effort every day. Because repetition is what builds familiarity. And familiarity is what silences the amygdala. There is also a profound role played by the prefrontal cortex in identity change. This is the most recently evolved part of your brain, responsible for long-term planning, self-regulation, abstract thinking, and most importantly for our purposes, the conscious evaluation of your own thoughts and beliefs. This is the part of your brain that can look at your identity and say, is this actually true? Does this actually serve me? Is this who I choose to be? When you engage your prefrontal cortex in the deliberate examination of your self-concept, you begin a process that neuroscientists call metacognition. Thinking about your thinking. Observing your beliefs rather than being controlled by them. And this act of metacognition is itself neurologically transformative. Research using functional MRI technology shows that simply labeling an emotion or a thought, putting it into words and examining it consciously, reduces its emotional intensity and decreases amygdala activation. Observing your belief that you are undisciplined with curiosity rather than shame literally changes the neurological signature of that belief. It begins to lose its automatic, unconscious power. This is why the awareness stage of identity change is not just a preliminary step before the real work begins. It is itself a form of neurological intervention. Seeing your old identity clearly, naming it, examining it, questioning it, is already beginning to dismantle it. Your brain is waiting to be rewired. The only question is whether you are going to be intentional about what you build. Chapter 4. The 5 Identity Anchors Keeping You Stuck. Now that you understand how identity is built and how it can be changed at the neurological level, we need to talk about something critically important. There are specific mechanisms that keep people trapped in old identities long after they consciously want to change. I call these identity anchors. And until you identify and address the ones that are operating in your life, any attempt at identity change will feel like trying to sail a boat with the anchor still dragging along the bottom. Identity Anchor 1. The stories you tell about your past. Every person carries a personal narrative. A story they tell about their life that explains who they are and why they are that way. Most people's personal narratives are organized around their failures, their wounds, their limitations, and their disappointments. Not because they are pessimists, but because the human brain gives more weight to negative experiences than positive ones through a mechanism called negativity bias. And these stories become identity. The person who says, "I've always struggled with money because I grew up poor," has made their history into their identity. The past has become a prediction, a ceiling, a defining characteristic rather than simply a thing that happened. The person who says, "I've never been good at relationships because my parents had a terrible marriage," has used their history to preemptively explain their future failures. They have given the past permission to write the future. The person who says, "I always give up because I gave up on things as a kid," has turned an old behavior pattern into a permanent character trait. These stories are powerful because they feel true. They are based on real events. They have real emotional weight. And they have been told and retold so many times that they feel like objective autobiography rather than subjective interpretation. But here is the thing about personal narratives that changes everything. The events of your past are fixed, but the meaning you assign to those events is completely within your control. The same story of poverty can mean you are limited by your origins, or it can mean you developed a resilience and hunger that most people will never know. The same story of a difficult childhood can mean you are damaged, or it can mean you survived something hard and are stronger for it. The same story of past failures can mean you are someone who quits, or it can mean you are someone who has been learning through failure how to eventually succeed. The events did not create your identity. Your interpretation of the events created your identity, and interpretations can be changed. This is not about lying to yourself or pretending difficult things did not happen. It is about recognizing that you are the author of the meaning you assign to your experiences. And as the author, you have the power to rewrite the narrative in a way that serves the future you are building rather than reinforcing the past you are trying to leave behind. Identity Anchor 2. The opinions of people who knew the old you. Human beings are deeply social creatures, and one of the most powerful forces shaping our behavior is the perception of others. When the people around you have a fixed image of who you are, and when you care about their opinions, their image of you becomes an invisible force pulling you back to who you were. Your family who remembers every time you quit something becomes a chorus of skeptical voices the moment you announce a new goal. Not because they want you to fail, but because their mental model of you does not include a version of you who succeeds at this kind of thing. Your friends who have always known you as someone who plays it safe may unconsciously resist your emergence as someone who takes risks. Your social identity, the version of you that exists in other people's minds, can exert enormous gravitational force on your behavior. This is compounded by something called the looking glass self, a concept from sociologist Charles Cooley. We construct our self-image partly by imagining how others see us. And when the people around us consistently see us in a particular way, their perception becomes a mirror that we look into when we are forming our own self-concept. Breaking free from this anchor requires two things. First, reducing the time and emotional weight you give to the opinions of people who are invested in your old identity. This does not mean abandoning relationships. It means being selective about which voices you allow to inform your self-concept. Second, and more powerfully, seeking out new communities of people who do not know your old story. People who meet you as the new version of yourself. People whose mental model of you was formed after you began your identity transformation rather than before. This is one of the most underestimated tools for accelerating identity change. When everyone around you sees you as the person you are becoming rather than the person you were, maintaining the old identity requires active effort. The social environment itself begins supporting your new self-concept rather than working against it. Identity Anchor 3. Comfort with the known pain. This one is counterintuitive and deeply important. Human beings will often choose known pain over unknown possibility. Not because they are self-destructive, but because the brain values predictability above almost everything else. A familiar negative outcome feels safer than an unfamiliar positive one because at least with the familiar, your brain knows what to expect. It knows how to cope. It knows the terrain. This is why people stay in jobs they hate for years. It is not that they do not want something better. It is that the discomfort of the known feels safer than the uncertainty of the unknown. This is why people remain in relationships that have long since stopped serving them. The pain of staying is excruciating, but the brain has mapped it, has built coping strategies around it. The prospect of leaving activates a different kind of terror, the terror of the unmapped. And this is why people keep returning to old behavioral patterns even when they genuinely want to change. The new identity is exciting in theory, but the process of living it out involves a period of profound uncertainty. A gap between who you were and who you are becoming where nothing feels solid or familiar. Your brain interprets that gap as danger, and it will do everything in its power to get you back to the known, even if the known is painful. Recognizing this anchor means understanding that the discomfort you feel when you are in that gap is not a sign that you are failing. It is a sign that you are actually changing. Real identity transformation feels uncomfortable. Always. Not because something is wrong, but because you are in new neural territory. Territory that your brain has not yet mapped. Territory that will become familiar with repetition, but that feels profoundly unstable at first. Normalize the discomfort. Expect it. And when you feel it, recognize it as evidence that you are doing the right thing, not the wrong thing. Identity Anchor 4. Binary thinking about change. One of the most destructive patterns in the psychology of personal change is all or nothing thinking. The moment you miss a gym session, you decide you are back to being someone who doesn't exercise. The moment you eat the wrong food, the entire diet is over. The moment you have a moment of self-doubt, you conclude that you were never really changing at all. This binary thinking is lethal to identity transformation because it treats every imperfection as a complete reset. But identity is not built or destroyed through single events. Identity is a trend, a direction, a cumulative weight of evidence. Missing one gym session does not make you someone who doesn't exercise. It makes you someone who exercises regularly and missed one session. The question is not whether you are perfect. The question is which direction you are trending overall. The person who goes to the gym 4 times this week and misses once is building a different identity than the person who goes once and misses 4 times. Even though both people exercised once in a week that included a missed session. The difference is in the overall pattern. The overall weight of evidence. The general direction of travel. When you slip, and you will slip, the correct response is not self-flagellation. It is not dramatic recommitment. It is not starting over from scratch. The correct response is to simply continue. To add the next vote for your new identity as quickly as possible. To treat the slip as a data point rather than a verdict. Never miss twice. That is the rule, not perfection. Not never slipping. Just never letting one slip become 2. Because 2 can become a week. And a week can become a month. And a month can become the rest of your life. Identity Anchor 5. Waiting to feel like the new person before acting like them. This is perhaps the most common and most crippling of all the identity anchors. The logic goes like this. I will start acting like a confident person once I feel confident. I will start acting like a successful person once I feel successful. I will start acting like a disciplined person once I actually feel disciplined. This is backwards. Completely, utterly backwards. Feelings do not precede identity. They follow from it. You do not feel like a confident person and then act confidently. You act confidently repeatedly until your brain accumulates enough evidence to update its self-concept. And then, as a result of that updated self-concept, you begin to feel confident. The action must come first. The feeling follows. This is supported by extensive research in behavioral psychology. William James, the father of American psychology, articulated this principle over a century ago. Act as if what you do makes a difference. Because it does. And specifically, act as if you are already the person you want to become. Not in a fake way. Not in a performative way. But in the specific, intentional way of someone who has made a decision about who they are and is casting votes for that decision through their daily behavior. You do not wait to feel like a writer before you write. You write. And through writing, you become a writer. You do not wait to feel like someone who has their financial life together before you make responsible financial decisions. You make responsible financial decisions. And through those decisions, you become someone who has their financial life together. The feeling is the reward for the action, not the prerequisite for it. Release the anchor of waiting. And step into the action now. Chapter 5. The Identity Reconstruction Framework. Now we have arrived at the heart of everything. You understand why discipline without identity change doesn't work. You understand how your current identity was formed. You understand the neuroscience of how it can be changed. And you understand the anchors that keep people stuck. Now it is time to give you the complete, practical framework for rebuilding your identity from the inside out. This is not a weekend exercise. This is not a one-time journaling session. This is a systematic, ongoing practice that, when applied consistently, will rewire your self-concept in ways that make your desired behaviors feel inevitable rather than effortful. There are 6 stages to this framework. Stage 1. Identity archaeology. Before you can build something new, you need to excavate what currently exists. Identity archaeology is the process of bringing your unconscious self-concept into conscious awareness so that you can examine it clearly and objectively. Most people have never done this work. They have operated from their identity for decades without ever stopping to ask where it came from, whether it is true, or whether it serves them. Here is how you do it. Set aside 30 uninterrupted minutes. Take a pen and paper, and work through the following questions honestly and without editing yourself. When I think about becoming significantly more successful, what immediately comes up for me? What fears, doubts, or resistance? What do I believe about people like me and success? About people like me and money? About people like me and discipline? When I fail at a habit or goal, what story do I automatically tell myself? What does that story say about who I am? What did the most influential people in my early life teach me, explicitly or implicitly, about what kind of person I am and what I am capable of? If I am being brutally honest, what do I actually believe about my potential compared to the potential I publicly claim to have? These questions will surface the actual identity operating beneath your conscious aspirations. The beliefs that are actually driving your behavior regardless of what you say you want. Write everything down without judgment. You are not evaluating whether these beliefs are right or wrong, helpful or unhelpful. You are simply making the unconscious visible. This step alone is transformative, because seeing your identity clearly, perhaps for the first time, creates the separation between you and your beliefs that is necessary for change. You are not your beliefs. You are the awareness observing your beliefs. And from that position of awareness, you have the power to choose differently. Stage 2. Deliberate identity design. Once you can see your current identity clearly, you can begin designing your new one. This is not about creating a fantasy version of yourself that has no connection to reality. It is about clearly defining who you need to become in order to create the outcomes you want. And the question that guides this stage is deceptively simple. Who is the person who already has what I want? And what do they believe about themselves? Not what do they do? Not what habits do they have? What do they believe? If you want financial success, who is the person who is financially successful? They believe that wealth is something they are worthy of and capable of creating. They believe that financial decisions matter and that they are someone who makes thoughtful financial decisions. They believe that setbacks are part of the process, not evidence of their inadequacy. If you want physical health, who is the person who is physically healthy? They believe that their body deserves care. They believe that investing in their health is an expression of self-respect, not a punishment or an obligation. They believe that showing up for their body even on hard days is simply what they do. If you want a meaningful creative career, who is the person who has built that? They believe that their creative voice has value. They believe that they are someone who creates, regardless of external validation. They believe that showing up to the work even when it is hard and imperfect is what separates professionals from amateurs. Write down the new identity you are designing. Be specific. Be concrete. This is the target your behavior will be aiming at. And knowing the target clearly is the first requirement for hitting it. Stage 3. The evidence campaign. This is where the real work begins. You now have a new identity defined, and you need to build evidence for it. Remember that your brain updates its self-concept through evidence, not through intention, not through affirmations, not through visualization, through actual behavior that contradicts the old identity and supports the new one. The key principle of the evidence campaign is this: start smaller than you think you should. Most people make the mistake of trying to prove their new identity through enormous actions. The person who decides they are now a fitness-oriented person immediately signs up for a marathon. The person who decides they are now financially disciplined immediately tries to save 50% of their income. These actions require willpower levels that cannot be sustained. And when they fail, as they almost always do, the failure becomes powerful evidence for the old identity. Start with actions so small that failure feels impossible. If you are building the identity of someone who prioritizes their health, your first evidence campaign action might be to drink 1 extra glass of water today. Or to do 5 minutes of movement. Or to cook 1 home meal this week. If you are building the identity of someone who is financially disciplined, your first action might be to track your spending for 1 day. Or to read 1 article about investing. Or to move $10 into a savings account. These actions feel almost embarrassingly small. And that is exactly the point. Because the goal is not the action. The goal is the identity signal the action sends to your brain. Every time you follow through on an action that aligns with your new identity, no matter how small, you cast a vote. And votes accumulate. 100 small votes for your new identity is infinitely more powerful than 3 huge efforts followed by collapse. Because the small votes build the neural pathway consistently, reinforcing it daily, strengthening it with each repetition, while the huge efforts followed by failure carve deeper grooves into the old identity. Scale gradually. As the small actions become automatic and identity consistent, expand them. 10 minutes of exercise becomes 20. 1 tracked day becomes 1 tracked week. 1 home-cooked meal becomes 3. The new identity is being built in the background with each expansion. The process is self-reinforcing because as the evidence accumulates, the identity strengthens, and as the identity strengthens, the behaviors feel more natural, requiring less effort and generating more momentum. Stage 4. Environmental architecture. Your environment is not neutral. It is constantly cueing, triggering, and reinforcing behavior. And it is doing so far more powerfully than your willpower ever can. Research by behavioral economist Richard Thaler and legal scholar Cass Sunstein, in their landmark work on choice architecture, demonstrates that the way your environment is designed determines an enormous proportion of your behavior. Often more than your intentions, your values, or your conscious choices. This means that redesigning your environment is one of the highest leverage actions available to you in the identity change process. If you are building the identity of a reader, put books in every room of your house. Remove the television from your bedroom. Delete the social media apps from your phone and put the Kindle app in their place. Let your environment make reading the path of least resistance and distraction the effortful choice. If you are building the identity of someone who eats well, fill your kitchen with food that aligns with your new identity. Remove or relocate food that doesn't. Prepare healthy meals in advance so that when you are hungry and low on willpower, the easy choice is also the aligned choice. If you are building the identity of someone who exercises regularly, sleep in your workout clothes. Put your gym shoes by the front door. Schedule your workouts in your calendar as non-negotiable appointments. Make skipping the gym require more effort than going. Environmental architecture also applies to the social environment. Seek out communities of people who embody the identity you are building. Online communities, local groups, mentors, peers, people whose normal is the version of yourself you are working to become. Jim Rohn's famous observation that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with is not just a motivational cliché. It is a neurological reality. Your brain is constantly observing, mirroring, and being shaped by the behavior patterns of the people around you. Choose those people with intention. Stage 5. Identity protection. As you build your new identity, you will face resistance. From within and without. And you need to be equipped to protect what you are building. The internal resistance will come in the form of the inner critic. That familiar voice that tells you this isn't really you. That you're fooling yourself. That it's only a matter of time before you revert. That other people can pull this off, but you are different. You cannot silence this voice. But you can change your relationship with it. When the inner critic speaks, practice responding with this simple reframe. That is an old voice. It belongs to an old identity that is no longer operative. I acknowledge it, and I continue. You are not arguing with the voice. You are not trying to convince it. You are simply acknowledging its existence and redirecting your attention back to the new identity. Back to the next action. Back to the next vote. Over time, as the evidence for your new identity accumulates, this voice will become quieter. Not because you fought it into silence, but because the new neural pathway has become strong enough that the old one no longer dominates. The external resistance will come from people who are invested in your old identity. Handle this with two strategies. First, reduce how much you share your transformation with people who are likely to be skeptical or undermining. Not because their opinion should control you, but because sharing a fragile new identity with hostile observers weakens it before it has the strength to withstand scrutiny. Let your results speak when the identity is established. Share the process with people who will support and encourage it. Second, set clear internal boundaries about which voices you allow to inform your self-concept. Not every person who has known you has earned the right to define you. Choose your identity mentors with the same care you would choose any other influential advisor. Stage 6. The Identity Review. Identity transformation is not a destination you arrive at. It is an ongoing process of refinement and expansion. Once a week, set aside 10 minutes for an identity review. This is a structured reflection practice with 3 components. First, evidence inventory. What actions did you take this week that aligned with your new identity? What votes did you cast? Celebrate these, not with excessive self-congratulation, but with genuine acknowledgement. Your brain needs to register the positive evidence. Most people rush past their successes and dwell on their failures. Reverse this deliberately. Second, anchor check. Which of the 5 identity anchors showed up this week? Did you catch yourself telling an old story? Did you slip into all or nothing thinking after a missed day? Did you catch yourself waiting to feel ready before acting? Simply naming which anchor was active gives you information for the coming week. Third, identity refinement. Is your new identity definition still accurate and inspiring? Does it need to be expanded or clarified? As you grow, your sense of who you are becoming will evolve. Allow the target to sharpen as your self-knowledge deepens. This weekly review practice keeps your identity transformation conscious and intentional rather than letting it drift back to autopilot. It keeps the new identity alive as an active project rather than a passive hope. Chapter 6. The Identity Statement, Your Most Powerful Daily Practice. There is one practice that ties the entire framework together. That amplifies every stage. That keeps the new identity activated and accessible in every moment of your day. It is called the Identity Statement. And it is the single most powerful sentence you can ever write about yourself. Most people describe themselves in terms of their history, their current limitations, or their external circumstances. I'm someone who has always struggled with money. I'm not really a morning person. I've never been good at following through. I'm working on becoming more disciplined. These statements all have something in common. They define the current self by reference to the old identity. Even the aspirational ones locate the new identity in the future, as something being worked toward rather than something being expressed right now. An identity statement is fundamentally different. It declares the new identity in the present tense. It anchors that declaration to real behavioral evidence. And it is written and spoken not as a wish or a hope or an aspiration, but as a statement of current reality. Here is the formula. I am someone who, new identity trait. I proved that today by specific action you took. Let me give you examples across different areas. Health and fitness. I am someone who honors my body. I proved that today by choosing to move for 15 minutes even when I did not feel like it. I am someone who fuels my body with intention. I proved that today by preparing a healthy meal instead of defaulting to takeout. Financial discipline. I am someone who builds wealth consistently. I proved that today by tracking my spending and making a conscious choice about where my money went. I am someone who thinks long-term about money. I proved that today by contributing to my savings account before spending on anything discretionary. Creative work. I am someone who shows up for their creative work. I proved that today by writing for 20 minutes even though the words felt clunky and I did not know where the piece was going. I am someone who values their creative voice. I proved that today by sharing my work even though I felt uncertain about how it would be received. Emotional intelligence. I am someone who responds rather than reacts. I proved that today by pausing before responding to the message that triggered me and choosing my words intentionally. I am someone who takes responsibility for my emotional state. I proved that today by using a reset practice instead of projecting my frustration onto someone else. Notice what these statements do. They do not describe the person you hope to become someday. They describe the person you are choosing to be right now. Today. In this specific instance, they do not require a perfect track record. They require one piece of evidence. One action. One vote. This makes the identity statement extraordinarily resilient. You can have had a terrible week and still write an identity statement based on one thing you did today that aligned with your new self-concept. You can have broken a habit yesterday and write a statement based on re-establishing it today. The identity statement is the smallest unit of identity change, and it is available to you every single day regardless of how you have been doing overall. Practice this every evening. Write it down. The act of writing activates different neural pathways than merely thinking. It creates a physical record of evidence. It makes the identity real in the external world as well as the internal one. Over time, you will accumulate weeks and months of these statements. And when you look back through them, you will see the pattern. The trend. The unmistakable evidence that you are not who you were. That something fundamental has shifted. That the identity you designed is becoming the identity you inhabit. This is the moment everything changes. Not the moment you set the goal. Not the moment you started the habit. Not the moment you had the breakthrough realization. The moment you look at 100 days of evidence and your brain can no longer tell the old story. The moment your self-concept updates to match the evidence. The moment the new identity clicks into place and the old one finally, completely, permanently loses its hold. Chapter 7. When identity change feels impossible, the hard conversations. Everything we have covered so far describes the mechanics of identity change. The framework, the process, the practices, but there is a layer beneath the mechanics that we have not yet fully addressed. And it is the layer that ultimately determines whether someone does the work or abandons it. It is the layer of grief. Because identity change, real identity change, requires a kind of loss. When you release an old identity, even one that has been causing you pain and limitation, you are releasing a version of yourself that has been part of you. Sometimes for decades, you are saying goodbye to a story that, however limiting, has also been familiar. Safe. Known. The person who lets go of the identity of someone who struggles financially is also letting go of the community, the shared language, the sense of belonging that came with that identity. The family dinners where everyone commiserated about money. The friendships built around shared financial anxiety. The narrative that made sense of difficult experiences. The person who releases the identity of someone who cannot sustain relationships is also releasing the protection that identity provided. If you are someone who cannot sustain relationships, you have a reason not to try too hard. Not to risk too much. Not to open yourself to the vulnerability of genuine connection. Releasing that identity means releasing that protection. And stepping into a kind of openness that feels terrifying. This grief is real, and it deserves acknowledgement. You are not just changing habits. You are changing who you are. And that is one of the most profound and difficult things a human being can do. There will be moments in this process where you feel a strange sadness that you cannot quite explain. A longing for the old version of yourself, even though you know that version was keeping you small. A grief for the story you are releasing, even as you build a better one. Do not fight this feeling. Do not rush through it. Let it be there. Grief is not a sign that you are moving in the wrong direction. It is a sign that what you are releasing mattered. That you were invested in the old identity. That you are taking this process seriously. Hold the grief and keep moving. There will also be moments of profound disorientation. When you have made enough progress that you are no longer fully the old person, but you are not yet fully the new one. When you are in the in-between. When neither identity feels completely real. This is one of the most uncomfortable and also one of the most important phases of the entire process. Anthropologists who study identity transition call this a liminal phase. From the Latin word limen, meaning threshold. You are on the threshold. Between two rooms. Between two versions of yourself. The disorientation of the liminal phase often causes people to rush back to the old identity. The familiar, however painful, feels more solid than the uncertain. And the pull back can be overwhelming. Here is how you navigate it. Focus on the smallest next action. When the big picture feels overwhelming and the identity feels unstable, bring your attention entirely to the next one thing you can do that aligns with who you are becoming. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Today. This hour. This moment. Cast the next vote. That is all. And trust that the cumulative weight of those votes will carry you through the liminal phase and into the stability of the new identity on the other side. There are also people for whom identity change is complicated by trauma. By experiences so painful and so formative that the old identity was not just learned behavior but survival strategy. For those people, the work of identity reconstruction may need to go deeper than the framework in this audiobook alone can address. If you have experienced significant trauma and find that your attempts to change your identity consistently run into walls that feel impenetrable, please know that this does not mean you are broken or beyond help. It may mean that the work requires professional support alongside your personal practice. A skilled therapist, particularly one trained in trauma-informed approaches, can help you navigate the deeper layers of identity formation that are connected to protective trauma responses. Seeking that support is not a sign of weakness. It is, in itself, an act of the identity you are building. The identity of someone who takes their inner life seriously. Who invests in their psychological health. Who refuses to let their past determine their future. We have traveled a long way together. We started with a simple, powerful truth. You do not have a discipline problem. You have an identity problem. And now you understand exactly what that means and exactly what to do about it. You understand that willpower is a bridge and identity is the destination. That forcing behavior that conflicts with your self-concept is an exhausting battle you will always eventually lose. That lasting change does not come from more effort applied to the wrong level. It comes from working at the level of identity itself. You understand how your current identity was built. Without your conscious consent. Through experiences, messages, and environments you did not choose. By a brain that was doing its best to keep you safe in a world it no longer fully inhabits. And you understand that this is not your fault and that it is absolutely within your power to change. You understand the neuroscience. That your brain is plastic. That neural pathways are built and dismantled through repetition. That the amygdala's resistance to change is normal and navigable. That small, consistent actions rewire the brain far more effectively than large, unsustainable efforts. You understand the 5 anchors that keep people trapped in old identities. And you have the awareness now to recognize when they are operating in your own life. You have a complete 6-stage framework for rebuilding your identity deliberately, intentionally, and permanently. And you have the identity statement practice. The daily tool that keeps the new identity alive and accumulates the evidence your brain needs to update its most fundamental beliefs about who you are. Now here is the only question that matters. What will you do with this? Because understanding is not transformation. Comprehension is not change. You can listen to this audiobook 10 times and emerge exactly as you entered if you do not take the knowledge from your ears and put it into action. The first action is small. Right now, today, after you finish listening, take out a piece of paper or open a notes app and write your first identity statement. Who is the person you have decided to become? State it in the present tense. What is one thing you did today, however small, that aligns with that identity? Use it as your evidence. Write the statement, read it out loud, and feel what it is like to declare yourself, perhaps for the first time in your life, as the person you have always been capable of becoming. That is the first brick. And every empire in history was built one brick at a time. You have been waiting for the right moment to become who you were always meant to be. This is the moment. You are ready. Begin.